So, hi everyone. We now start with our today's session on building operational resilience. A very quick introduction on today's panel. We've got a very distinguished panel today, consisting of Andrew and Jimmy. Both of them have been formal regulators and obviously worked with some of the largest banks in Europe, leading the operational risk domain. Andrew is specifically very well known and extremely respected figure in the operational risk domain, having previously led the operational risk supervisory design and architecture with the UK FSAPRA. He's also been on the BCBS operational risk working group. Subsequently, he worked in senior roles with HSBC and Credit Suisse. Jimmy, again, similar background, having worked on both sides of the table. So being a regulator, supervisor, as well as on the bank side. And he's been advising to some of the largest financial institutions on the operational risk, operational resilience areas. Our third panelist today, David, has got extremely interesting profile, having worked on the front line and looking after the business and operation. Then he moved to the second line and looked at the operational risk management. So he's got a very unique experience where he's looked both from a frontline point of view as well as from the operational risk or second line defense point of view. So I welcome all of you today, Andrew, David, Jimmy, and thanks for agreeing to come on this webinar. We have got participants today from many different geographies. So from Middle East, from Europe, South Asia, primarily, and some participants from Africa. So we've got a fairly diverse participant profile today, ranging from different continents. Next slide, please. So what is, while some of us who are at the fag end of this crisis, and many of us are still in, middle of the epidemic. What has been interesting from discussing the experiences of different banks, and we have spoken to over 50 CROs in last couple of weeks, and try to understand how well banks have dealt with the crisis so far. Generally, the message is that overall banks feel, and it's also evidence that banks have managed to respond well to the epidemic, but obviously there are a few areas where they've identified the challenges and they have, in their own opinion, fell short of what they thought they could do. So what interestingly institutions doing today, we haven't come across any institution so far who is formally structured lessons learned exercise. And the reason is that many of them slowly coming back to work. So right now the focus is moving back to the normal mode, or as all of us say now, the new normal mode. But based on the discussions we have highlighted here, few areas where bank faced significant challenges for different line of businesses. For retail, for example, the response at call centers have been a big challenge, and that also led with increase in the fraud experience and cyber issues. Same issues on the payment side as well, wherein the wholesale bank, if you look at the major challenge has been the increase in transaction time, because though the operating model changed overnight, they have not realigned the overall structure of approval as well as the risk. So there are areas we have highlighted here. We'll circulate the slide, but the key message here is that we have yet to come across an institution which is formally structured a lesson learned exercise. So they collated response internally, but we haven't seen anybody who's structured a formal exercise around what went well and what did go wrong. So next slide, please. The common message, though, from every single conversation has been around the term resilience. So resilience suddenly have gained huge prominence in the discussions. Obviously, initially it started with business resilience, and now increasingly the term operational resilience has become a focus for the management discussions and reviews. And we thought it would be interesting just to depict the concept through a very simple graph. Most of us in the operational risk domain are familiar with the the severity graph. So what you see here on the x-axis is the duration of disruption, and on the y-axis is the scale of impact, going from low to severe on the duration and low to extreme on the scale. And interestingly, because when we have conversations around operational resilience, the first question which every single bank we have spoken asks that how is it different from business continuity management, or how is it different from the operational risk management. So what we have depicted here, if you see, a simple concept where if you have an event which traditionally has been a business continuity event, and your BCM normally deals within two phases. The phase where the event is managed well within your recovery time objective, RTOs. So, you're fine, and the detailed policies, processes around it, how to deal with it. Even if it goes beyond your recovery time objective, yeah, there are provisions to deal with it, where you've got provisions around maximum outage time. And now what is interesting is that typically it is assumed that through the this journey or the duration of disruption, finally the scale of this event will come down, and it will not be a high impact event. Unfortunately, as all of us have discovered recently, that we had an event which actually where the duration of disruption became extreme or severe, and the scale of impact was extremely high. So what you see on the graph at the top quadrant, if the event moves into that direction, majority of the banks have no provisions or no framework or management processes to deal with such a scenario. So there is no formal structure where we deal with a high impact event where the duration of disruption is extremely severe. And that is where we have put a question mark. So what do we do in this scenario? And that's why regulators or the management globally talking about the operational resilience. And we have no better person among ourselves to explain this, who's been first-hand involved in designing such a framework from regulatory perspective, and also then worked with large banks. So I will invite Andrew to tell us why suddenly operational resilience has become so important both for banks and for regulators. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alok, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all. During this section, I'm going to focus on three particular elements. I'm going to ask, why is operational resilience important? I'm going to talk about what it is, and also I'm going to say a few words about the regulatory view. So if we look at the next slide, firms need a robust and effective operational resilience framework to ensure they can continue to provide key business services, irrespective of the events they face. And the starting point in all this is that a failure to adapt, respond to, recover and learn from disruptions could impact the safety and soundness of a firm and the financial system. So that's why we need to worry about it. The important thing when we look at this slide is these are a number of sources of potential operational resilience events. And I've there pictured the institution within the blue bubble. And I think the first point to note is that even people within the blue bubble can contribute to a resilience event. So, and these type of resilience events tend to be self-inflicted. And I'll talk a bit later about the operational resilience and the art of looking stupid, but they tend to be self-inflicted. So you could decide that you're going to upgrade your IT system. That upgrade may not work. The system might be down for hours, days, or even weeks. There are other ways in which an internal actor can disrupt the organization and result in an operational resilience event. One of those is they could deliberately or accidentally damage a firm's IT capability. The most obvious way of that is by falling foul of an external phishing event. And I'm sure most of the organizations on this call run internal phishing exercises where you send spoof emails to your staff and see if they respond to them. And of course, those that respond to them get to attend some training to explain to them or explain to me, in my case, why I shouldn't have clicked on that particular attractive offer that came round. And operational resilience also comes from outside. And financial institutions are constantly under cyber attack by individuals, organized crime, and nation states. I was in a very large organization once, and the head of security had to leave a meeting. And I saw him later in the day, and I said, you know, what happened? Is everything okay? And he said, oh no, we experienced a cyber attack. And I said, you know, how many do you get? He said, we're constantly under cyber attack. This one was just a bigger attack and maybe slightly more effective. So institutions constantly under attack by all sorts of organizations. Also, there's potentially geopolitical and social economic developments that could impact a firm. For example, in the UK, we occasionally see, and have certainly seen in the past, anti-city demonstrations. They impact organizations and their ability to carry on. And there are lots of geopolitical and socio-economic factors that could result in a resilience event. And in the bottom right hand, we've got climate change. And I think this is a potential factor which really hasn't been fully appreciated, but you only have to think of the Australian experience at the end of 2019 when they were experiencing bushfires in a number of states. That was impacting firms' resilience. And ironically, the reason that those bushfires came under control was because they had 3 or 4 days of extremely heavy rain, certainly in New South Wales, and that resulted in flooding. And that also brought challenges for firms' operational resilience. And lastly, on this slide, we've seen recently the impact the pandemic could have on firms. And I'm sure a year ago, even those firms who had good pandemic plans in place had not considered the possibility that the entire workforce or the entire country could be in lockdown and working from home. So this is why we need operational resilience. If we move on to the next slide, we can see there are a number of important challenges that make it difficult to build a robust and effective operational resilience framework. The first one is technical innovation, and the pace of technical innovation really is quite amazing. You know, we have fintech firms that are disrupting financial networks, artificial intelligence that gives competitors and those intent on causing harm new ways of doing things. We've got new assets, we've got distributed ledgers, we've got crypto assets, but also we've got changing behaviors. Everybody wants to be able to access their bank accounts instantly. You can make a payment instantly. I've done that this morning. Many people never visit their branch. I recently had to go to my branch for a transaction I couldn't do online, and I really was left bemoaning the fact that I couldn't have done that without having visited the branch. Lots of people prefer to use their phones, their iPads, their laptops. And it's interesting, when I entered banking many years ago, payment was by check. And if you paid a check in, you normally had to wait 3 to 5 days to get cleared funds. It's impossible to imagine in this day and age that anybody would happily wait 3 to 5 days for cleared funds. Everybody wants instant payments. But firms really have an issue around skills. They lack the skills and knowledge to keep pace with all these changes. Many struggle with obsolete systems. Cyber incidents are increasing and have increased dramatically this year. Costs were under pressure before we went into the pandemic. Lots of organizations had announced cost-cutting measures, they'd announced redundancies, and while those were put on hold, those cost-cutting measures are now being reintroduced. And because of the impact of profitability on financial institutions, a lot of those cost-cutting measures are more extensive than they were before. The system's very complex. Do firms really understand their third-party exposure? I'm afraid I still hear stories of firms who don't understand all their third parties. We have the issue of concentration risk. Do you understand if you're just dealing with one party? And what about cross-border dependencies? And if you've worked for a Swiss bank, as I have, you certainly see that. So these are all challenges to building operational resilience. And as we've just seen live, and we're experiencing it in a fast changing environment, it increases the risk of extreme but plausible events. In addition to COVID-19, the pandemic has demonstrated that resilience events can increase risk and threaten growth. In order to remain operational, many firms have had to relax the activities that can be undertaken out of the office. Many controls have been relaxed, sometimes without appropriate governance, particularly early on in the pandemic. And many financial institutions, as I said, have experienced a downturn in profitability, and that could result in them not being able to meet their strategic targets. Now, interestingly, after the global financial crisis, which was also a severe challenge to financial institutions, we saw that those firms with robust and effective risk management frameworks performed better than those without. And there's every reason to believe that when we look back at the winners and losers of the pandemic, those firms with robust and effective operational resilience frameworks will have performed better than those without. Another reason why we need operational resilience is the potential for a regulatory impact, and that can be in terms of fines and customer compensation. So in the UK, some time ago, we had a large outage in the RBS NatWest Ulster Bank Group. That resulted in a £42 million fine from the FCA, £14 million fine from the PRA. Redress to customers was 70 million, and even non-customers were compensated. So what is operational resilience? This is the definition that the PRA have been using. It's the ability of firms to prevent, adapt, respond to, recover, and learn from operational disruptions. And I think it's important to recognize that while we talk about the ability of firms to prevent A lot of the focus in operational resilience is what you do after you've had the event. And I think this is a fascinating new dimension to operational risk management, where the focus has very much been on preventative controls rather than the controls that you have in place to mitigate the impact. One of the important things about operational resilience is it assumes that events happen. I was in a large financial institution. They appointed a new head of IT risk, and he came in, and the first thing he said to the board was, "We will get an IT event." Now, that was very challenging for the organization, because the assumption up until then, as it has been in many organizations, was that you can prevent these events from happening. So operational resilience, the assumption is that the events will happen. We've seen that. And so it's about how you manage that outcome, how you mitigate the outcome. And it's also important to recognize, and we know this because we've just lived through months of it, operational resilience isn't just cyber. And I think if we look back to when operational resilience was first being discussed, you can see that it was principally an IT and cyber thought process that was going on. It's different from business continuity. Business continuity is a single point of failure. You lose a building, you lose a system, you lose a building, people go off and work in your business continuity center. Operational resilience is about the ability to deliver important business services. So it's across the whole process for delivering those business services. And I said earlier, you know, the potential for reputational impact from operational resilience. This really is the art of looking stupid. In the UK, the TSB had a significant operational risk event when they were trying to move to a new framework for their provision of their services. And the outcome was so bad that in the end, the TSB employed a legal firm, Slaughter and May, to undertake an independent review. And their subsequent report is extremely damaging to the TSB board and its senior management. It's on the internet, it's on the TSB website if you want to go and read it. It's well worth looking at. It's difficult to find because it's quite critical of the TSB. It may be that they've chosen not to make it easy to find. But imagine being a member of the board or the senior management when a report is published that says the board didn't understand the risk or the limit of people's capability. They didn't take the necessary steps to assess the capability of the people developing the new platform. Risk oversight and audit failed to identify important issues and ensure sufficient action post go live. Imagine being in risk function or even in audit and reading that. And the criticism that the board should have sought independent advice on the program as a whole from a suitable independent advisor. So pretty damaging experience there for the TSB, for its senior management and its board. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that the international regulators have certainly been aware of operational resilience and have seen its importance for quite some time. The BIS replaced the old operational risk working group that I was lucky enough to be a member of with an operational resilience working group. And in December 2018, they published a paper. As I said, at that stage, it was very much about cyber. And so their paper was about cyber resilience and range of practices. And the European Banking Authority also at the end of last year published a regulatory framework for mitigating key risks. But these frameworks were very much in the cyber and IT space. And if we look at what national regulators are doing, the Fed in the US and the OCC have recently highlighted operational resilience as a supervisory priority. And they published a couple of reports, and their details are there if you want to go and have a look. I think interestingly, and it may be because of the types of events that I mentioned in the UK, the UK regulators, and that's the Bank of England, the PRA and the FCA, seem to be leading on operational resilience. And certainly they've produced a couple of very informative papers. The first was in July 2018, which was a joint discussion paper. And it was one of, if not the most downloaded paper they've ever produced. And then they followed that, ironically, in December 2019, so just before the pandemic, with a consultation paper which set out the draft rules. Now, I say there the consultation closes on the 3rd of April. Actually, the closure date was extended to, I think it's end October, to give people time to deal with the pandemic while also developing their thoughts. And I think it's worth noting that there are a number of steps that the UK regulator is proposing. The first is identify your important business services. What is it that's important to you, important to the continuity of your organisation? Set impact tolerances for those business services. They don't have to be duration based, but you could see that they might be. You know, how long would I be prepared for this particular important business service not to be available to my customers? Once I've set those tolerances, I need to monitor them, make sure I remain within them. I need to identify and document the resources that I need in order to produce those important business services. So, you know, what people do I need? What systems do I need? I then need to undertake some severe but plausible scenarios where I make sure that I can continue to deliver those important business services. And then finally, the regulator suggests that you undertake a self-assessment where you produce a document which would go to the board, where you say how you're performing against the previous 5 elements. So thank you very much for that opportunity. I'll hand over to David now.
So thanks to Alok and to Andrew for, I think, taking us through that. I'd like to spend probably about 15 minutes before I hand on to Jimi for a panel Q&A session, where I'll go through some of those building blocks in a little bit more detail that Andrew has just mentioned, and also try and link it, as both Alok and Andrew mentioned, about building on what you've already got, and the links into existing business continuity frameworks or operational risk frameworks, which are really, really important to use and not to set off and start to create something new under this banner of operational resilience. But before doing that, I'd like to ask one question, if I may, which is this polling question, which I think hopefully you can now see. So having heard what you've heard today, and I think potentially, you know, before joining this, you have an interest for joining this seminar already. If you're just looking at your own organization and then thinking of how big you are and your customer base, in your opinion, how mature do you think as an organization you already are towards resilience? So is it something that's really not being considered yet? Is it something you're just beginning to consider? You think you're already partially resilient or mostly resilient, or in fact you're all the way through the journey, or are you just not sure at the moment? So if you'd be so kind to select an answer there, and I'd be really interested to see on the answer that comes back, if that's okay, please. Okay, hopefully has everybody already, I guess, clicked a button, if they're going to do so. So do we have any results, please? Or is this maybe something we need to come back to later?
Yeah, so we already have some polls. Okay. I'm not sure how to share the screen, but let me announce the same. So we have around 27% of the participants selecting the second option, which is just beginning to consider it, and 42% surprisingly already partially resilient. We have about 15% on already mostly resilient, about 4% on already fully resilient, and about 8% on not sure. So clearly the winner is the third choice, the already partially resilient.
Okay, thanks. I think that's probably a reasonable outcome that I would have expected, because there is a lot of resilience already in the system. As again, I think others have mentioned, and we've just seen through COVID, where maybe before people resilience or premises and the ability to work from home might not have been considered, we really are seeing in practice how we've managed to, if you like, survive through this recent crisis. So I think that's a really interesting spread, and actually that does feel realistic to me. Okay, so if we could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm very conscious in going through these steps that this is the steps that the UK regulators have already set out. But I think if we step back from that, and I think other regulators, the BIS, etc., are looking at this, the US, I think we could say that this is kind of emerging best practice on how to proceed. And it might be this is not followed exactly, but the principles behind this, I think, make a lot of sense internationally and are not just UK specific. So I've got some slides on each of these that I'd like to touch upon as I go through. But here, these are the steps that Andrew has already mentioned. And it's taking you through 8 major steps from, first of all, setting out your framework and your governance. One of the key questions is, well, what are my important business services? And I'll mention that a little bit more. The tolerances, and the tolerances here I think is really interesting, because again, as Andrew's mentioned, the assumption is that something has happened, something bad has happened, your customers have been impacted. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But in setting the tolerances, you need to look at the customer view. So what is unacceptable for your customers as far as a tolerance, which is expected to have at least a time element in it, to not be able to conduct those services with you as their service provider. Mapping is very important, but the reason you're mapping is to identify the resources required and the vulnerabilities that might arise. And from those, or to identify those vulnerabilities, that's where step 5, scenarios, comes into play. And again, and I think that the poll actually shows this, many institutions already do carry out scenarios. You carry out scenarios on business continuity, probably particularly around cyber, phishing exercises, etc. And we're actually living through step 6 here around lessons learned to do with COVID at the moment, where maybe a lot of the processes have not changed, but here the impact is really around the people and possibly the ability to access premises and therefore working from home. And then the communication plans. So both internally into the regulator and out to your customers. Again, the world has changed dramatically. A major outage at a bank now, it might be the first time the management of the bank are hearing about that is actually because the customers are on Twitter or some other social media saying that they cannot access those services. They might be seeing that or hearing that before their IT department actually has even realized that there's a problem. And the final part on self-assessment, and this again highlights the importance and the role of the board in all of this. And I think that's one of the key differences maybe between the building blocks and the several building blocks that go up to make resilience, is that the overall picture now hopefully actually has senior management board oversight to make sure that a company is resilient. It's not those various bits and pieces behind that. Okay, so if we could just go to the next slide, thank you very much. Then here, this is really, I think, just highlighting the different areas between operational risk, business continuity management, and then operational resilience. I think I've already kind of touched upon a number of these, but maybe one of the things around also is the testing, the number 5 there, is that under resilience, we're seeing an end-to-end approach. So it's all the way from maybe a customer requesting, I'll say a payment, because I think we all understand that, all of the internal processes that needs to go through, and then the customer actually having their payment made and either receiving the money if that's what they've requested or able to make the payment to another person. It's looking that end-to-end, I think is one of the key parts here. And just on communication at the bottom, yes, there are already communication plans in place, particularly around incident management, I would imagine, and crisis management. So it's just a question, I think, largely in many places where they're already fit for purpose for what they currently do, is taking those and viewing them in a slightly different way. That front to back, that horizontal view that we see under number 1, business services, that we're then able to see how that actually happens end to end from the customer's perspective. Okay, if we could just move on to the next slide. And in about the next 5 minutes, I will just try and go through the next few slides, touching on a few things. Again, we've put quite a lot of information or quite a few slides, but we wanted, if you like, to show a little bit of the substance behind what we're talking about, hopefully, for you to take away. And I think on the right-hand side of these slides, I think one of the things I really like that Alok has done in putting these together largely is to ask questions. So not be prescriptive about how you do things, but asking questions to hopefully stimulate thought and think about, well, how do we do this? What are the roles and responsibilities of our first and second line events? So on this, the framework is key, and the roles and responsibilities are key. And this is really highlighting the importance of the board setting that and setting and approving what those services are, but then also having that assessment, being able to say hand on heart, we know what we're good at, we know where we need to improve, and we've got a plan on how to improve. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So identifying the business services. So this really is the starting point, or one of the key starting points, because for the number of business services or important business services you define, then the work increases from there around mapping, identifying resourcing, the scenario testing. So this is a key element. And I think one of the key questions here that gets asked is, well, how many important business services would you expect a firm to have? I think in general, the consensus in discussion is probably in the tens rather than the hundreds. And if you're thinking of a service, and I've mentioned payments, so I'll continue with that. I think, you know, the end-to-end service for a customer is potentially a firm, a bank, an insurance company, another financial institution, being able to take the request for a payment from a customer, process it all the way through and make that payment, even under severe events taking place. So I think that, if you like, is the important business service, but then there might be different channels or methods by which that service can be delivered. So again, a lot more being done by mobile phones, internet requests, etc. All of that is very important, but you might have to go into your branch. You can maybe do things by telephone as well. So again, I think that's one of the important, really key starting points around those important business services. Tolerances, I've mentioned, are very important. And again, this is recognizing that bad stuff does happen. And this is looking at it from the customer's perspective, maybe looking at vulnerable customers. And again, substitution. So could the customer potentially use a rival or another method to actually achieve their business service, in which case, you know, they have resilience themselves, if you like. If we move on to the next slide, please. And then the mapping. So here, the resources in the top middle box are talking about people, process, technology, facilities, information, and third parties. So I think this is actually a pretty good catch-all of everything that you need to actually deliver those important services. And it's really important that we're able to look at those. And again, you will find that some of the resources like IT, data centers, etc., they will underpin several key important business services. So not every important business services, for instance, will have different technology or different facilities. There will be common factors there. So you already, if you like, have a good basis, I think, for looking at what you've got. Third parties, Andrew mentioned, I think is a key one. Again, one of the key or a potential concern at the moment is the use of the cloud and resilience around the cloud. So again, this is a really important area. If I move on again, thank you. So scenarios. Again, a lot of work probably already done around disaster recovery, business continuity, IT infrastructure, potentially, you know, already switching over from different data centers or, you know, for live, etc. So A lot of these scenarios are already tested, but this is where we need to think a little bit more and look at the end-to-end rather than a point along the delivery of the important business service, so that we can really identify, well, what are the vulnerabilities and actually where do we need to do some work on this. So on the next slide, please. Lessons learned. So if we think about what we're learning from COVID now, we will learn far more from everything we've been through in the past few months and than we ever would have done from a desktop scenario. So these lessons learned, things that have actually happened to the industry, to the population, or just to the firm specific ourselves, are really important ways of learning important information. And then on to the next one, please. Communication is key, and looking at those internal communication plans. And again, if I could just move on to the next slide, please. So what is a sensible way to look to build operational resilience? You could disappear into a very dark room for a very long time and come out with a perfect framework that might not then work in practice. And that's probably taken far too long. So I think in our view, one of the first things is to understand where you are. Again, the polling question, I think, highlights a good degree of self-awareness for people of where you already are. Having looked at where you are, then where do you want to get to? Designing that framework, but then probably a pilot is a really important way of taking this forward, to identify one of the important business services and then run that as a pilot through the framework. You can then iron out the details from that. And one of the really key things in doing this is linking into your existing operational risk frameworks, your existing business continuity frameworks, incident management, communications, etc., and the roles of the first, second, and third line of lines of defense. It's really important to build on what you've got. And at that point, then you can look at, I think, at rolling that out. And I think training in all this and awareness is the key, and the buy-in of staff and culture. Again, those are all potentially big topics, but I think it's probably good for me to leave that there. And I think we've got about 15 minutes remaining. If I hand over to Jimi, I think for maybe a panel Q&A question session. Thank you. Hi, Jimi, you there?
Hello, hello everyone. I think there's a technical problem on my video. I think the host needs to allow my video to start. But while that's been sorted out, if I could welcome David and Andrew to this virtual podium. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes to do a bit of a Q&A session, where I think we'd like to explore some of the themes that came out of those two really interesting presentations. But also please do send through your questions, and we'll do our best to, the video's on now, and we'll do our best to cover those in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So the first question that I'd like to cover, and I'll hand this over first to Andrew in a moment, is a question which is probably the #1 question that gets asked when we do these webinars and when we do courses and training around operational resilience. And that is a pretty fundamental one. You know, actually, what is operational resilience? Is this a new risk? Is operational resilience a subset of operational risk management? Where does BCM fit in this? Now, I think from my perspective, the UK regulators have been quite helpful on this, in that they clarify that actually operational resilience is effectively an outcome of effective operational risk management, which I think helps to better understand how it all fits together. But maybe if I could ask Andrew for your thoughts on how you view operational resilience, and whether you see this as being a new risk, or how you see it relating to particularly operational risk management, but also business continuity management.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. And I think this is a really key question. And operational resilience isn't a new risk. I think the spotlight from the COVID events has certainly highlighted a lot of interest in operational resilience. It's suddenly become something very live, but I don't see it as a new risk, and I see it as part of the operational risk umbrella. And I think that operational resilience, and some regulators won't agree with me here, operational resilience sits under the operational risk umbrella. It's something that we already undertake to a certain extent. And so we have a lot of activity that's being done in the op risk space in terms of scenarios and those sorts of things, communicating in the business continuity space. So it's something that we're already doing. I just don't think that we've been doing it in a way that is easy to demonstrate. So I think it's a bit like when operational risk first came in. Everybody had been managing operational risk for years. Banks had always managed operational risk. What they lacked was the joined up framework and the ability to demonstrate that they're doing it. And so I think that's the important thing with operational resilience. If you want to build an effective and efficient framework, build a framework under your operational risk umbrella. You should, many firms already have business continuity management under that operational risk umbrella. And there are some big similarities between what you do in business continuity management and what you do in operational resilience. The key difference is that operational resilience is across a business service. Business continuity management is just the loss of a single thing, a building or a piece of software or something like that. But there's a lot of things that you're doing in business continuity management. You already have good communications with your stakeholders. So there's a lot of attributes from business continuity management that apply in operational resilience. But the big thing for me, if you want to build an effective and efficient framework, do it under your operational risk umbrella. Please don't go out and build a separate and entirely bespoke operational resilience framework. We saw firms do that when we were talking about financial conduct. Firms went off, built these huge and impressive and expensive frameworks, then discovered 3 years later that when they were working out their financial conduct risk and working out their operational risk, the operational risk that they ran, they were measuring apples and pears. They were using different systems. They didn't check with each other. They didn't coincide with each other. You couldn't give a holistic view to the board. So please don't do that and do it under your operational risk umbrella. Thank you, Jimmy.
So I guess kind of a follow-up to that, Andrew, before I bring you in, David, so you coming in there. Andrew, is to what extent are you able to leverage the existing operational risk framework, or do you expect that there will be a need for tweaks and enhancements and changes to firms' existing operational risk management frameworks to be able to deliver operational resilience?
I think you can certainly leverage what you're doing already. So if you've got a good and strong operational risk framework, then you've got lots of things you're already doing. But I think there are some enhancements that you can do. And if you think, I always come back when I'm thinking of this to the bow tie. And for those of you who are familiar with the bow tie, you have causes on the left, the event in the middle, and the impacts on the right. And the great thing that operational resilience has brought to the risk management debate is this focus on managing the impact. And that's something that we haven't done before. We've tended to ignore impacts. We've just said, oh, they're a consequence of whatever the event is. But now operational resilience is giving us a lens at which we can look at impacts and see how we might manage those impacts. And I think that's the big area where operational resilience can really add something to the operational risk framework, because once you've applied that process to your operational resilience events, then maybe you should look to apply that to your operational risk events. What can I do when I have an event? What can I do to mitigate the impact of that event? So certainly you should be able to leverage, but there are some areas where you need to enhance what you're already doing.
And we have, I think, a very good question to bring you in on David, which is coming from one of the audience members. who asks or says, as I understand from the answers, OR, I think meaning operational resilience, can be some sort of grouping of operational risk management activities. Is this true?
So I think the simple high-level answer on that is yes, but there is a lot of interconnectivity there. So I think one of the benefits from this for op risk management, op risk activity, and the awareness of the board towards this, I think, is resilience does give the potential, I think, for people, if they need to improve that area. So in looking at this, it might be that, yes, operational resilience is an outcome underneath the operational risk, I'll say umbrella, in its broadest sense, but maybe it's not able to deliver it at the moment. So actually we need to strengthen our operational risk framework as an example, or areas within. So I think the answer is yes. And I think the really, really important part in all this is, before you try and design something new under, well, don't try and design something new under operational resilience. First of all, look at what you've got and how that contributes to all of the building blocks, because firms already have a great deal in place. And if I could just say maybe one other thing around the benefits of this, because money is going to be extremely tight for everybody. Okay, regulatory imperatives, you know, go towards the top of the tree as far as decision making and cost allocation is concerned. But I think if this is done smart and we do this effectively, and if you're looking at this from the customer's impact and providing better services to your customers, which makes you hopefully more profitable, if you're looking at maybe the different ways, even for different customers, that business services are delivered, it does give you a chance to potentially standardize what's being done. And if you're then standardizing and cutting down on alternatives, you're potentially reducing cost. And on that, you then might be able to automate and digitize. So, you know, this whole movement towards wanting to do that, I think resilience actually could also help to drive, because if you're doing that, you're actually making yourself more resilient, you're more cost effective, and you're giving your customer a better service and hopefully making better profit.
Thank you, David. I think something else that we've all seen, and it's really been a trend, I guess, post the global financial crisis, is that a number of firms, perhaps a majority of firms, the trend has been to bring the operational risk framework, you know, as we say, upper level. So it's focused only on those most material operational risks and key controls. Whereas I think one of the challenges for leveraging the operational risk frameworks to deliver operational resilience is you do need to have that sort of greater level of granularity that allows you then to do that mapping that you talked about, David, and to be able to get that end-to-end horizontal view across the organization where you're looking at important business services. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And again, just looking at one of the questions that's come up, again, which is a really excellent question around, do we need specific operational resilience systems, or could we use op risk systems? I would say, and I think what we're seeing is that vendors of operational risk systems, GRC systems, are looking to develop operational resilience modules, which will sit within those systems. But then ideally we have the ability to access things around processes, around key controls, around risks, around the RCSA framework, which helps give you some insurance around your resilience. So yeah, I think that is also a key aspect. And one of the things, again, if we're looking at what the UK regulators are saying, is, you know, they do not expect this to be done on spreadsheets in the future because it's just too big a topic.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. So I think we have time probably for one more question, which I think I'll direct at Andrew, on this whole issue about leadership within the firm, within the organisation. And again, it's a big question that gets asked very often. Who should be leading within the organisation on operational resilience? And looking at this from a 3 lines perspective, should it be the first line? Should it be the second line? How do you see that?
It is a great question, and there's a couple of things that I'll say before I start. One is that the UK regulatory authority, we have a senior managers regime, and they have given responsibility for implementing and reporting on resilience to the chief operating officer. And the lens I would like to look at it through is the operational risk lens. And so if you think of operational risk, you have an operational risk department that sits in the second line. They write the policies that have to be followed, and those policies are applied to the first line, and the first line have to follow them, have to implement those policies. And I think we've got the same going on here. The first line has to implement the operational resilience policies, but I actually think they should be written in the second line within the risk function. In an ideal world for me, an umbrella function sitting under the risk function, and that's where the policies should be written. They should also, the second line should exercise, and I hate this term, but it's oversight and challenge, so that they can look at how the framework is being applied. And also they can do the review at the end of the process. So the second line of defense has an independence from the people that are implementing it. So for me, in a nutshell, responsibility for implementing it and reporting on it sits in the first line. Responsibility for drafting the policy, making sure the policy is followed, and doing that self-assessment process, and looking at things that go wrong as well. That needs to be done independently. That should sit in the second line under the CRO's office, and ideally under the op risk umbrella.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're out of time on the panel. Thank you very much to David and Andrew, and over to Alok for closing remarks.
Thanks, David, Andrew, Jimmy. There are quite a few questions we have received, and unfortunately, due to the time constraint, we have not responded to all. So I'd like to tell the audience that we will be sending a follow-up mails with the recording of the today's event and with the slides. And we will put the Q&A at the end of the slide deck. And there are, few questions around operational risk capital and related. So we'll be doing that and make sure that all the questions raised today are fully answered. What I would also like to announce that the objective of today's session was to introduce the subject and give an overview. We will be following this with a series of master classes, and where we will be going deep into each of the building blocks. As David said, that because each building block then will take up a significant amount of time in terms of using the concepts and the underlying design of the operational resilience framework. So thank you again to audience. We are overwhelmed by the response today, and we will stay in touch with you on the following master classes on this subject. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.